Next up, we have Breeanna Kelln. Breeanna Kelln is the Beef Industry Research Chair in Integrated Forage Management and Utilization at the University of Saskatchewan. It was funded by industry, government, and GIFS. There we go. So she's co-appointed in the Departments of Plant and Animal Sciences. Her research interests include pasture rejuvenation, grazing systems, beef cow winter feeding systems, forage and pasture management, and crop livestock integration. Today she's going to present on integrated forage management and utilization, but I'm hoping in the future she's going to become a collaborator. I know she's already contacted us about bringing some of kind of Quibina's approach and our approach that way to the forage world. So anyways, let's welcome Breeanna.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So when Ian reached out to me, we actually had a little conversation because I wasn't quite sure what I had to offer to a group like you guys. But once we talked, really I think today my presentation, I really want to just kind of set the stage for forage research in Western Canada, kind of what's been happening, where I see things going, and hopefully just open the door for some conversation moving forward. Like Steve said, my name is Breeanna Kelln, and I'm new to my role. I started September 1, but my role is actually a new position. So 10 years ago, the Canadian beef industry did an analysis, and they just, from that analysis, they found that there really was a need for more forage research in Canada. And so it took 10 years in the making, but this position came to fruition this past summer, and I started in September. So that's kind of the background to my role at the university. And like Steve said, I am a joint between plant science and animal science. So I came up through the animal science program, but I'm actually a majority plant science faculty member with a minority in the animal science department. Let's see if I can get this to work here. Okay, good. So today I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Canadian beef industry and why integrated forage management and utilization research is important. I'm going to talk a bit about my past research and give you some examples just to kind of explain, where my brain is when I'm doing research, and then talk a little bit about some of the future forage research that I can envision. So I wanted to set the stage and talk about the importance of the Canadian beef industry. For those of you that don't know, there's 60,000 beef cattle operations in Canada that are deriving at least half their income from beef production. So, an obvious economic contributor to the Canadian economy, cash receipts in 2020 were $9.1 billion. We are an exporter, an export country of beef. So we export nearly half of our beef production. So we export that on, we're a global player, I guess if you want to think of it that way. So we export and compete, or we export to countries like Japan, China, Mexico, South Korea. But the importance about, and what my talk today is going to be about really is thinking about Western Canada specifically. And the reason for that is that if you look on the chart here, you can see beef cows per province. In Western Canada, namely Alberta and Saskatchewan, we have over 70% of the beef mother cows housed here in these two provinces. So that's why this research is important. It's why it's important in terms of Western Canadian production. When we look at some of the challenges that face our Canadian beef industry, you can see that, again, we are that global player. We are competing in terms of export nations against countries like the United States, Brazil, China, India, Argentina, Mexico. And so, you think about competition with some of those countries, and they are producing beef in a very different environment, very different climate than we produce beef. Our producers are having to deal with extreme conditions to winter these mother beef cows. The wintering period in Western Canada is over 200 days a year. So over 200 days a year, these producers are having to provide some sort of a stored forage for these beef cattle in order to winter them. And they're doing that in these types of conditions, competing against countries like, Brazil and Argentina. So of course that, can create some frustrations, but it also just adds to the cost. It adds to the cost and it increases, fossil fuel usage, and there's all these things that go along with feeding beef cows in Western Canada. Think about some more challenges. There's headlines like this, why methane continues to be the cattle industry's biggest climate change challenge. Eating less red meat is something that we can do to help the environment. Oops. And, what is the climatarian diet? So these are recent headlines, and of course, just more pressure on the industry, in terms of the way that we produce beef. But it's not all bad news. Don't want to get you all down here. When we think about Canadian production, we know that our Canadian grasslands sequester carbon emissions of upwards of 3.62 million cars per year. So this is an important thing to talk about in terms of, we talk about our emissions, but this industry actually provides what, we can talk about or think about as, those ecological goods and services. So they're providing more than just the beef that you're going to consume. They're providing, carbon sequestration. They're providing habitat. So there's over 1,000 plant, animal, and insect species that make their home on these Canadian rangelands. And so, of course, like biodiversity, habitat, those, endangered species, habitat, these are all very important things that this industry provides to Canadians, not just in terms of the food that they're going to consume. And then just another little snippet here, but in Canada, producing 1 kilogram of beef now creates 15% less greenhouse gases than in 1981, and that's just really due to, efficiency of production. And so I like to say that, our Canadian beef industry definitely is rooted in, it has a history of tradition with the beef industry, but, we are innovating and we are reducing our emissions, and that's proven over time here. So, what is integrated forage management and utilization research? I think I have kind of a unique opportunity here to create this. Like I say, it is a new role. And so as I go through the presentation, I'll talk about some, of my ideas going forward. But some of the stuff that, we're going to do or that we've done in the past, it really is going to be, multidisciplined applied forage research. So that might mean that we're working on a large scale. So we're talking, 60 hectares with our animals. And this is, you can see we've got cattle grazing in the summer. We're looking at things like methane emissions off these grazing ruminants. So while they're actively grazing, we're measuring methane. We might be doing winter projects, looking at different ways to reduce that cost of winter feeding, but then also looking at, how does that impact the soil and the crop the following year. Small plant research, of course, we will utilize that as well. And then laboratory experiments. And so kind of, the whole gamut in terms of how can we analyze these systems and how can we understand their impact on the animal, the plant, the soil, and the environment. And that really is the connection. So connecting the dots between the animal, the plant, and the soil. And then I've also included, some factors that are equally as important, such as economics, social science, why are producers making decisions and how are they making those decisions and what are some of the barriers to adoption. We have best management practices that may or may not be taken up, and why is that? Is there a barrier to adoption that we haven't identified yet? And then all of that plays into the role of the industry in terms of its impact on the environment, and then of course summarizing and finalizing that up in terms of food security. So forage research is critical, and it really is the backbone and the basis for advancement of our Canadian beef industry. So we really need to develop our cow-calf and our backgrounding sector. Those two sectors are going to provide those calves that go into the feedlot market that then are harvested and put on the plates that you're eating. As I said, we house a lot of the beef cattle in Western Canada, but over 96% of the tame and native pasture is also contained within Western Canada. So that's again why it's very important to have research that has a Western Canadian focus. Over time, and this is where things start to kind of evolve, I guess, is, over time the pasture and productivity of these pasture and haylands declines. So, we've seen that there's been research show that over a 30-year period, the decline, or those yields from those pasture and haylands have declined. Variables such as fertilizer fertilizer pricing can be correlated to this. So there's been some research that's showing that as these pasture productivity declines, producers are less and less, and fertilizer, prices increase, they're less likely to rejuvenate or do a treatment to those fields in order to increase production. So I think the latest numbers were something like, 70% of Canadian tame pasture would not be rejuvenated unless it was at least 11 years old. And then out of that, like 30% would never be rejuvenated. So those pastures are just kind of put into production, and then nothing's ever done to them, to increase productivity. So, due to that declining productivity, then we see that acres are taken out of production. And so this is Stats Can data looking at 2011 to 2016. And you can see that from 2011 in the dark orange to 2016, we lost over 1 million hectares of tame total hay and pasture tame acreage. And so that's big, when you think about, carbon sequestration of those perennial forages. We think about, ripping up that land and having, stable carbon being emitted. We think about biodiversity and habitat for endangered species. All of that plays into, why it's important to not have these acres decline. But it is tied somewhat to a change in farming practices or in farming operations. So we see that there's also a decline in terms of livestock-based farms from 2006 to 2011, and that is correlated with an increase in cropping-based farms. And so that's on the tame pasture side, but then we think about our native grasslands here in Western Canada, and there's headlines like this, Canadian prairies vanishing faster than the Amazon rainforest or the Great Barrier Reef. And I think, if all of us were to ask, a friend or someone that was maybe not maybe involved in agriculture, what are some of the, global, most ecologically systems that are under pressure, you might think of the Amazon rainforest or the Great Barrier Reef, but rarely would someone, think about our Canadian grassland prairies, and they are they share a stage in terms of their, pressure that they're under. We look at cow-calf costs and prices. This is recent data, but you look at the costs that are all associated in keeping that mother cow over 365 days, and you can see that feed and bedding accounts for 40% of the cost of production, and pasture accounts for 28%. So when we think about, kind of that low-hanging fruit or where we can make a difference, those really are the two areas. So winter feeding and summer pasture are, huge costs for these Canadian producers, and so that's really a starting point in terms of how, having an impact on the industry. So what they feed and how they feed it are the two biggest costs for the Canadian cow herd. Just a few more points just to kind of set the stage, but we look at forage prices. I think a lot of people realized there was a drought, obviously, the last few years, and cow-calf producers and forage producers really were, they were hit just as hard. And so when we look at, forage prices, alfalfa and grass hay nearly doubled versus its price in 2020. Straw prices were up 2.5 times. Year to date in Alberta, the forage prices were 40% increase over 2021. So again, when you think about a producer trying to manage that, it becomes extremely difficult for them to manage those variation in prices. Average feed cost was up 47% in Western Canada versus 2020 prices. And then this is as well important. So hay production in 1980 was estimated at 2.2 short tons an acre. Sorry, I didn't do the conversion there. And and currently it sits at 1.8 tons per acre. That's a 5-year average from 16 to 20. Multiple reasons for that. Those acres, or those perennial forages are being kind of pushed maybe to more marginal lands than they would have in 1980, but definitely an area for improvement. If we could even get back to having production like we did in the 1980s, that would make a significant difference for Canadian producers. And of course, we've got low production, but we've got farmland values which have doubled in the last 10 years. So these producers are really needing, because of land prices and such, they're needing to produce more on their existing acres, because for some of them, just going out and buying more land isn't going to be an option for them. So this is where I'm just going to step in a little bit and talk about some of the research that I've done in the past. And the first here is just looking at improving grazing capacity through the introduction of bloat-free legumes in a pasture stand. This is what some of the work that came out of my PhD research. And I guess really why this is important is that, again, looking at strategies to improve forage productivity on these acres without having to break them up and reseed them. A break and reseed is extremely expensive. Your land is prone to soil erosion, and it's you've got loss of carbon. So if we can think about ways to just rejuvenate these pasture stands without having to do that, we'll be in a better place. So this was a 5-year grazing trial at Lanigan. Looking at basically, could we sod seed these legumes into an existing pasture stand? So just go in and direct seed right into it without having any cultivation beforehand. And what would that do to botanical composition? Could we get these species to germinate and grow in that type of environment? We also did a 2-year grazing study looking at methane emissions from these animals. And then we did some laboratory work again, looking at digestibility and methane emissions. We had 2 site locations. So we had Lanigan, Saskatchewan, and Lethbridge, Alberta. And again, it was a 5-year study. So they were seeded in 2015. Again, just sod seeded directly into an old pasture. And then 3 years at Lethbridge. So again, at Lanigan, we had 30 hectares. We split that out into 2-hectare paddocks. And then at Lethbridge, we had a 7.2 hectare field, so slightly smaller. And that was a monoculture alfalfa, whereas at Lanigan, we had a mixed brome grass alfalfa. And then what we did was we took our 2 species, so we had Sicer milkvetch and Sandfoin, and we sod seeded those directly into those pastures using this implement here. This is called an agroplow. So at Lanigan, we had then 60 steers that grazed in 16, 19, and 20, and 45 steers that grazed in 17 and 18, and that was just based on available forage and the drought that we experienced midway through this study. And at Lethbridge, we were lucky enough that this site had irrigation, so we were able to graze 32 steers at this site. But what we did find when we looked at grazing management across the years was a significant variation between the length of time that those animals were able to spend on the grazing plot. You can see that at Lanigan we ranged from 82 days in year 1 down to 20 days in 2017, and again just has to do with the drought that we experienced. So extreme variability, and if you think about a producer trying to manage that, it does become very difficult. Lethbridge was really no different. We did see large variability from year to year in terms of the length of grazing that we were able to accomplish. So when we look at the species composition, were we able to seed these species and then have them proliferate and grow and persist within this environment? And you can see that when we look at Sicer milkvetch in the dotted bars, and then we have Sandfoin in kind of the checkered. You can see that we did see a difference between the species. So the Sicer milkvetch managed to really maintain itself from year to year over that 5-year period. It was variable, but it did kind of consist throughout that 5-year 5-year period fairly well. And then we did see a decline in our sandfoin. This was different than what we saw at the Lethbridge site. So the sandfoin actually did quite well at the Lethbridge site, which was a monoculture alfalfa. And so there's been some work to show that there is some synergy between alfalfa and sandfoin. And I think that's really what we saw here. Our site at Lanigan had that meadow brome grass, which could have created some competition and not allow for that sandfoin to persist. And so I think that's an area that really, I think in terms of forages could be explored better when we start thinking about multi-species growth. We're breeding these forages, in a monoculture, but then we're taking them and putting them into multi-species pastures under, inclement conditions, and then, applying grazing pressure to them. Look at forage yield. This is really something that a producer is going to want to see. If they're going to do this rejuvenation strategy, are we going to get any greater yield out of it? And unfortunately, we really only saw that yield bump in that first year at Lanigan, and then it kind of dropped off and remained the same as the control. Forage quality, okay, we didn't see anything, in terms of a yield bump, but were we able to see an increase in quality? And unfortunately, we didn't really see a difference there either. We did see, with the introduction of these legumes, you would expect that you would hopefully see an increase in crude protein. However, it was quite variable from year to year. And then cost. The cost was really something that needs to be talked about. And when we look at the overall 5-year gross returns, we saw that the total returns for the sod seeding event was, we did see an increase in terms of the total amount of returns. However, once we factored in the cost of the sod seeding, then there was really no difference between the treatments. So it kind of, sounds maybe a bit negative, but we did see that when we ran some of the Rusatech work in terms of the in vitro, like rumen fermentation work, we were able to find that with increasing levels of Seiser milk vetch, so that additive effect of Seiser milk vetch into the diet, we did see an increase in microbial protein production as well as the efficiency of microbial protein production. And so that really is something kind of interesting, and it could lead to production efficiency. And so that's kind of an area to be studied. Just a few slides on some winter feeding work, and again, this is where looking at an annual crop system, maybe not that perennial system, where a producer would have, say, an annual crop barley field, and then they're going to harvest it in different methods and feed that to their animals throughout the winter in different scenarios. And so for this study, we looked at beef cow performance. Of course, that's number one, reproductive efficiency. But we also wanted to look at how those winter feeding systems, since we've got that animal out there producing, harvesting that feed, and then as well expelling that manure directly onto the soil. How does that impact soil nutrient level distribution, soil density, crop biomass the following year, and system cost of production? So this was done 3 years. It was a 3-year study. Again, we had an annual cropped field that was split and then we used 3 extensive feeding systems. And so we harvested that barley crop either in a swath and let it stand in the swath, and those animals grazed that swath through the winter, or we baled it up into bales and kept those bales on the field and they grazed on those bales in the winter, or we harvested it and removed the grain, and then those animals went back and they grazed that residue. And then we compared that back to kind of a traditional way of feeding, which would be being fed in the dry lot. And I'm not going to get into too much of this, but just I think it was important just to understand if we're imposing these grazing treatments on these animals, what does it do to the soil the following year, nutrient distribution? It might help producers make a decision on where they place their bales, in terms of what's the nutrient load that's going on to that soil, and then following that up with, how does that impact crop biomass the following year? So long-term vision, really to work with a variety of groups. I have a few of them listed here. And look at, again, research that's relevant to Western Canada, different soil zones, and have an impact, understanding the impact that soil zone will have. And then connecting the dots between, plant science, soil, animal science, and economics. And I think that's really kind of the picture. Systems, understanding the system, not just looking at the animal as one piece of the puzzle, but looking at, the whole system and how does the animal impact the soil, impact the plant, and, how does those three interface together. Long-term vision really is to, increase forage production, understand the, animal-plant soil interface better, and at the end of the day, improve the economic and environmental sustainability of the Canadian beef industry. Got a few slides, or one slide here just on kind of some short-term objectives, just some, some research ideas or some grant proposals that I've got together and hoping that, maybe it'll spur some discussion. Perennial stand productivity and longevity is really the big low-hanging fruit. Is there, what can we do in terms of grazing management? In terms of stocking density on native grassland. How does that impact greenhouse gas emissions, soil, carbon sequestration, all of those types of things. Again, stocking density. Really, there hasn't been a lot of work done on stocking density. So, really, how we have these animals, but how should we graze them? In terms of the amount of animals per hectare of land and per given time point. We don't really know and understand that very well. And does it play a role in terms of how we can rejuvenate these tame pastures to increase productivity? Flower color, fall dormancy rating of alfalfa in binary mixtures under a multi-harvest system. So this is another project, we know that there's potential for yield in terms of fall dormancy rating, but we don't know really how does that translate into digestibility, and are we going to see an increase in digestibility? And then the final is crop livestock integration. So looking at novel cereal pea mixtures. So again, we don't really know a lot about what is the ideal ratio of inclusion of pea into a cereal in terms of its effect on on the soil and the crop growth, but also then in terms of nutrient supply to the animals. So when we think about peas, of course, supplying that amount of protein and crude protein into the livestock diet. Livestock integration into annual cash cropping. I question if maybe there's a way to include livestock, whether it's residue grazing or by strategically rotating them into an annual cropping system in order to kind of benefit the overall say 5-year plan of that acre. And then extended winter grazing. Most of the research has been strictly looking at just one winter grazing scenario, but not looking at how can we stack them together. So do we strategically use swath grazing and then bale grazing, or do we stockpile some forage, native forage and then bale graze on top of that, and kind of what is the ideal way to structure the winter feeding season for these. For it to be a win-win for the livestock producer, but also the soil and the plant. So in closing, I believe multidisciplinary forage research is critical to advance our Canadian beef industry. And these grazing ruminants and the forage production really play an integral role in terms of the climate change solution. They have this synergistic relationship, and whether that is on tame forages, or if we think about our native grasslands that evolved and they require that grazing pressure in order to produce and perform the way that they need to. But either way, there's a synergistic relationship, and I think we need to understand that better. And with that, I will say thank you for your time. Thank you for having me, and I can take any questions if there is some.